Welcome back, everybody, to Theory Underground. I'm your host, David McKerracher, and today we are joined by Ted Reese. How's it going, Ted?
Good. Thanks for having me on again. How are you?
It's really, it is technically an again. I'm fine, by the way. It is technically an
Okay.
again, right? But technically, also this is your first time in the sense that you've never been introduced on Theory Underground, the platform itself. You've only been introduced on Theory Plebe, which is uh, has been sublated into Theory Underground, and so the main difference being for the last couple of years, I've been realizing the issue with Theory Plebe was it was a self-deprecating nickname for a kind of influencer personality, and that what I'd much rather be doing is education, which is to say the conversations I find most educational that I already have with people that I know in real life that I want to somewhat formalize and bring out into the light of day for other people to also get that basis in that conversation. That needs to be set up, and it can't just be done on a regular YouTube channel or on a podcast. I actually have to build my own little framework with its own containers so that people can binge courses and do the whole thing. And so Theory Underground is its own website. App is on the way. It's a course gated social media not, I don't want to call it communities, but it's basically social media if courses were the gateways into various forums. And so the conversation about critique of political economy is the one we're not even really getting into until spring of next year. It's only really been scratched on the surface and touched on here and there. It is fundamental to the project, but it's been put off for some. I've got to prioritize some other stuff. Chris Catrone might do a course with Theory Underground before then, where he'll be teaching the platypus syllabus, the history of the left, et cetera, et cetera. But actual critique of political economy, which is one of the most important things in the world of theory, is sort of this like vanishing mediator that is kind of just in the background for everything that anyone new to this stuff probably isn't even consciously aware of just yet. And so I think you coming on here on the second day of the live stream marathon is really important, because I think the real point of what I hope we'll get into today is that people don't understand the relevance of the actual project that Marx had undertaken, and the significance of some of his discoveries, which have been strawmanned and dismissed on such flimsy bases as terrible characterizations, and as we've gotten into in the past, just the worst interpretations possible of his work. And so we'll get into all of that and your book on Grossman and everything like that. But first, I kind of want to just step back and say, like, okay, how are you doing? And would you like to introduce yourself to my audience?
I'm doing okay, thank you. Here in sunny Britain, sunny but cold and windy Britain. And yeah, so I'm Ted Reese. My last book was The End of Capitalism, The Thought of Henrik Grossman. My first book was Socialism or Extinction, and there's a shorter one in between called Humanizing Production. And yeah, I uphold Henrik Grossman, who I believe was the best defender of Karl Marx's crisis and breakdown theory in the 20th century, and who I find particularly relevant again as capitalism ages and sort of lurches into a deeper and deeper sort of dominance of automation in the process of production, and that is kind of like the area of my work, trying to apply the developments in technology to the present economic system and trying to anticipate what that means and how it's playing out.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and I've read large portions of your Socialism or Extinction, which was enough to make me realize that this is a book I need to reread more carefully. And then I've read your book on Grossman that just came out. Was it last year, 2 years ago?
Nearly a year ago now, yeah.
Cool. And Nance, who you just met in the background, who's also the main moderator in the chat, he read it as well before I had met him even. And so,
Great.
yeah, so at least two people in this conversation who are not you have some basis in the subject matter. But basically, what we need to talk about is like, what is it that people are missing when they try to think critically about reality? But first, I want to say, I'm sorry for the miscommunication. For anybody who is joining in the next few hours thinking that we're going off of the schedule that's currently up on the screen, no, we're not anymore. The new plan is we're going to have a solid conversation, and then Michael, who's joining from Poland, is just going to join an hour late. And it's funny and weird that he actually couldn't have joined on time anyway, because right when I was letting him know about this backup, his power went out and he lost his internet. So then he got a hold of me on his phone to say that that was the case and maybe he wouldn't be able to do this, but his partner was getting in contact with the electrical grid people, and they said, and this was the crazy thing, oh no, it won't be up until I think it was like 11 p.m. CET, whatever an hour later is. So literally an hour later is the time that his electrical grid's coming back. So this must be so important that God has turned off his electrical grid. So
Kismet, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, but for future reference and just all time, I'm not going to use CET to the exclusion of London time on a schedule for people joining internationally, because I forgot in a moment of naivete that the world clock is the London clock. It sets time for the rest of the world, and I mentioned that to you, and you said what was it you said?
Something along the lines of bow to the British Empire.
Yeah, I think you said that's the one last thing we've got. Yeah,
we're keeping that. Yeah,
you might not have a queen, but at least you've got
we've got a royal family.
Yeah, it's true. So people think that political economy is about as antiquated as the royal family. That'll be my segue here back into critique of political economy, because what's the point of critique of political economy if political economy in its classical sense is no longer relevant? And so I think that maybe that's a good place to begin. What do you tell a person who might say that? Like for instance, I saw a person at Platypus Affiliated Society attribute to Chris Catrone the statement that critique of political economy was as culturally relative at the time as like cinema critique could be today, that it's actually the only reason it really mattered for the revolutionary agenda was because that's what everybody was reading, and now because nobody reads that shit, it's less relevant than the political agenda. Why might you disagree with that?
Well, it's certainly not relevant to enough people, but it should be, and the crux of it is it's relevant because it gives us the best opportunity of anticipating the future. Obviously, we can't do that in a fully specific way, but by studying Marx and his theory of capitalism, we can better anticipate the general tendencies of capitalism, and we can explain that it is a crisis-prone system in not least in economic terms. Marx used to write about decennial crises, as in they tend to strike every 10 years on average, and that is still the case today. If you average out the years between every recession, it still more or less levels out at striking every 10 years. So, and then when you go back to Marx and Grossman, who, Grossman wrote, as Marx did, that an economic contraction will tend to be worse than the last one. And that's what we've seen. We had the dot-com bubble burst around the turn of the century. Then we had the financial crisis and the so-called Great Recession, which, shows how deep that recession must have been, that it got that name and that reputation.
Right.
And then we had March 2020, which was the fastest, hardest US stock market crash on record. So something very, very important is happening economically, and no one else is explaining it in theoretical terms other than Marx and Grossman, as far as I'm concerned. What we hear is human error or greed or incompetency, you name it, or we hear about crony capitalism, or we hear about neoliberal capitalism, and it's explained away fundamentally by policy choices, which might be motivated by other factors like greed or whatever.
Like inflation defined by the more libertarian tendencies. They say that inflation is just an increase in the money supply, and that we saw a drastic increase in the money supply, and that's what was driving the supply chain issues, right?
Yeah. So they stop there and they don't ask, well, what drove the money supply, and their answer is the central bank. But why did the central bank do it now, and not 20 years ago or 30 years ago? Why did it wait to now? There's no explanation, and that is easy to that line of inquiry is easy to sort of expose, because they often just go back to, like I say, the central bank in 1913. So everything started to go wrong in 1913 when the central bank was founded. But the central bank was founded in response to 1907, when the US had its first national banking crisis, and which resulted in a big international recession. And so the central bank was founded in response to that, to try and prevent that from happening again. It created new efficiencies that that propped up the system in the best way it possibly could at the time.
Right. And so what they tend to see as a sort of conspiracy on the part of a band of elites is actually a very rational response to a crisis that is ongoing but periodically returns, and you're saying on average it returns every 10 years, and that's been going on since when Marx was taking notes and studying this stuff, right? And so this generally is called the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. It's a theory in the tradition of critique of political economy, and it's one that people in the Second International before the time of Lenin wrote off in most cases, right? They were seeing significant gains in Germany. They were seeing the developed world going in a more positive direction. Kautsky was losing his revolutionary fervor because he was seeing a sort of class conciliation, and workers were getting representation and rights. And Bernstein was like, you know what, maybe the whole thing's wrong. And then Bauer comes along and he goes, you know what, I tried to do like a projection and it shows that the tendency for the rate of profit to fall is like actually bullshit based on like my 4-year projection. And then Grossman comes along, as you show, and Grossman's like, yeah, but if you project it out like, I don't know, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, that's wrong. And so Is that an unfair summary of the inheritance of this on the part of Second International Marxism?
Only slightly. Like, so they didn't dispute that the rate of profit tended to fall, but they basically dismissed the importance of that and said, it can continue to fall forever without ever tending all the way to zero, sort of thing. And so it's not a major concern, because in Bauer's schemas, it showed that despite the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, that accumulation continued uninterrupted. But as you say, it was only for 4 cycles or years.
Oh.
And for some reason, he just stopped there. I mean, it's hard to really say anything other than it was just intellectual laziness, or willful intellectual laziness, perhaps. But yeah, Grossman continues with the exact same schema, doesn't change anything, and it breaks down after 36 years. It comes to a point where it can't reproduce itself, and that's where he shows that capitalism. So this is like an abstract schema, like a mathematical pattern, and you follow it through, and it shows that the system has to break down at some point. And even Bauer's schema was too generous, in the sense that it had a 2-to-1 ratio of constant capital, which is the value of means and production, to variable capital, which is the value of wages. So we know from empirical reality, from empirical data, that constant capital tends to grow faster than variable capital. So the outlay on production tends to grow faster than the outlay on wages. But Bauer's schema had a 2-to-1 ratio on this, whereas Grossman's thinking, well, it should be much higher, even as a starting point. But he went with the 2-to-1, so it only breaks down after 36 years, whereas if it had been something more realistic, it would have broken down sooner.
And this breakdown is what culminates in the Great Depression?
Yes, yeah. So with a breakdown, you end up with a surplus of capital that can't be reinvested for a profit. Capitalism, the motive for investment is a return on your investment that is greater than what you put in the first place. That's the essential basis. And if you're not getting a greater return, you're either going to slow down your investment, or you're going to reduce it, or pull it all together, depending on how thin the margins are. So you end up with a surplus of capital. It can't be reinvested. You might be able to do something else with it. You might be able to throw it into speculation, for example, and then you get a housing bubble, for example, or a financial bubble, where you're getting glorified betting on the stock market. But all that does is it sort of enables the winners of that glorified betting to win out at accumulation, whereas all the others, all the losers, therefore see their own individual accumulations breaking down. So for the winners, that has an aggregate effect of restarting accumulation of the system in general. But alongside this surplus of capital, you get the surplus of unemployed labor that this capital can no longer afford to employ. But then this manifestation itself is the solution to its own manifestation. So the crisis solves the crisis, because when you get this surplus of capital that can't be reinvested, demand for capital falls, and so prices fall as well. And that triggers panic selling on the market, and then that sort of process of devaluation enables a new round of investment, where it's now cheaper than it was before to buy new means of production and resources and labor power, crucially, in order to expand and innovate production. So capitalism needs these crises on average every 10 years.
Or do you think that you're getting better at describing what goes on as now that you've written enough books about it and you keep making appearances places talking about it? Because I think that was the most succinct you've put it so far. That was really good.
I'll have to take your word for it, because it's when you yeah, thanks is all I can say is thanks, because when you're talking about it a lot, it's hard to gauge, but you would hope.
Right. Maybe it just makes more sense to me every time I hear it. So
maybe.
I guess I look forward to hearing questions from chat. Also, I hope that people in the chat will share this out to social medias and try to bring some people back, because I think we lost some people over the last hour while things were stagnating, while I was just rolling pre-recorded content. And so, yeah, do share this out all over the place. I know there's like some of you use Reddit, some of you use Twitter, whatever you're ashamed to be using right now, just go share on it for fuck's sakes. Because we need to get a little bit more blood in here. But with that said, I think the reason that this matters so much is because of the word re-rationalization. Like, I think you call it, you might just call it rationalization. But I say re-rationalization because it just makes it a little bit more clear what we're talking about, because the economy is always rationalized in a certain way. Every workspace is rationalized in a certain way. Rationalization is an ongoing process. So to say re-rationalization kind of is redundant, but I also think it adds emphasis, because if rationalization is always going on, then in a sort of sense, it's like it's never going on, because we're just used to it always going on. But the point is that these crises bring about emphasis and points of emphasis in the re-rationalization process. So I'd like to actually hear some good examples from you related to past crises and the rationalization that those past crises drove. But is your light just turning on and off?
Sorry, I'm in a hotel and I don't know what I think the bulb's gone.
It's a really great. It's a really great light. When it works, it's awesome, you know. but then it turns
without
off.
It on, it looks like I'm just sitting in the dark room and I'm just looking for some company on the internet.
It's true. So I guess before we talk about the specific superstructural kinds of responses to the COVID pandemic, and how those were a form of rationalization that made sense given the crises that were occurring at the time, could you give us a couple of examples of rationalization?
Okay, so the rate of profit falls, investment gets pulled, production gets cut. So to overcome that, you need this process of devaluation that I talked about, where the demand falls and so prices fall. But there's other forms of counter tendencies to this breakdown tendency that help to revive accumulation. One of those is the tendency towards monopolization. So a larger company, say, will buy a smaller company in order to expand production. So that's one way to expand production. And then that merger of two companies and the two systems of production that they had into one is more efficient. So that can reduce overheads and therefore re-widen profit margins. Another one is you could save money on storage. So I think everyone probably knows about the just-in-time system of production we have these days, which was, I believe, sort of popularized by Toyota, the Japanese car manufacturer, and is a system where you no longer need to store all of your spare parts. You can order them in and have them arrive on the production line just before you need them. So that will save you some costs. Those are two of, and that was quite relevant during COVID because food companies or supermarkets do it a lot now. So when we had the panic buying, you saw a lot of empty shelves, because even the supermarkets are doing these sort of just-in-time delivery systems now because it saves them money. And it's not just, the instinct for saving money, it's the impetus that a fall in profit gives a company to search for these solutions for rationalization.
So like the perfect example of that, obviously, that should come to a lot of people's minds is when a factory gets closed down and offshored to some other country where labor laws aren't in place, and therefore, like Nissan, which a lot of the people who live in this neighborhood where I'm at in Aguascalientes, which is kind of a middle class neighborhood, like they get to live a pretty good life off of $4 an hour that they're making at the Nissan factory, like right behind me. Right. So this Nissan factory being here is because they can, pay that much for labor. And so
Right.
that's a form of rationalization, but as is, and this is more, I think, like a cool pop culture thing, is Office Space. Like the whole backdrop of everything taking place in the movie Office Space is that the assessor people are coming in to figure out which inefficiencies they can remove. And there's like the one guy who's been working there for all those years, but he doesn't actually do anything. And then they actually fire him, but they don't tell him that he's been fired. And then he stops getting paychecks, but they don't even tell him why. And then they just tell him to go in the basement. And like this whole thing is about what actually, it's comical, but the basic thing is like, yeah, if you're not being efficient, if you're not the most efficient, then when it comes time to raise profits, because profits are decreasing, then they're going to come in and figure out a way to, wait a minute, we could have this one person do those 5 people's jobs. And this is something that you talk about with mergers as well, is like, if you've got one person taking calls throughout the day, but they only get a few calls throughout the day, well, you do a merger and each company had that person. Well, now one person can do the same job. They're going to be a bit busier, but the other person, bye-bye. And so obviously automation comes into play here. Obviously the self-checkout stands at the grocery stores comes into play here. The fully automated McDonald's that just went up in Texas comes into play here. And so it's fully automated. There's not a human inside that McDonald's, right? So these are all forms of rationalization. And so I guess now that we've set the basis, then now it's time to talk about COVID, right? You wrote an article called Capitalism Needs Lockdowns, and it was banned off of Medium. And then I tried to share it on Facebook at the time, and it was banned off of Facebook. I think it was from everything we know about Twitter and its approach, they definitely were blacklisting people who were talking about these kinds of things. Now, obviously, from the standpoint of the progressives working there, they just don't like conspiracy theories, and there's a lot of reasons to not like conspiracy theories in general, in this kind of general sense. But also, there's something deeper going on in 2 ways. Obviously, there's something deeper going on for regular working class people who are thinking, yeah, but is this really all that's going on? As opposed to the more fundamental thing, the basis in Marxist sense, which would be the fact that everything going on in the political conversation, in the spectacle of left versus right, when it came to this whole thing, was within parameters established by the base, and that was what we were seeing in 2019. So what can you tell us a little bit about what we were seeing in 2019, or what you were seeing in 2019, because a lot of people weren't paying attention.
So when I published my first book, the first version of it came out as an ebook, and that was at the start of 2019. So none of COVID had kicked off by that point. And in the book, I was predicting a massive economic crisis, bigger than than 2008. And I was saying that we might be heading into a period of high or perhaps even hyperinflation. And obviously we haven't reached hyperinflation yet, but we certainly can't rule out that that's going to unfold in the next period, the next decade or so. I've lost your sound.
Oh, sorry. What about eggs going up for like $8 a carton in the United States? Is that not is that, if that's not hyperinflation, then what's hyperinflation?
Well, hyperinflation is when like you get general very, very high inflation across the economy.
The whole thing.
But
okay.
you could, yeah. But so anyway, that's
Because-
what I was saying. And at the
Yeah.
time, not many other people were saying that, and certainly on the left, there's a debate I had with Sam Kangaloo, who is a MMTer, who was predicting a deflationary crisis, and that might happen, but the inflationary crisis got here first. So anyway, in 2019, it was obvious that we were on the cusp of another recession. It had been over a decade, and it had seemed to me that they had been prolonging economic growth purely through austerity and debt. So austerity, essentially redirecting public subsidies into private subsidies. So cutting public spending to prop up private capital, and then the debt on top of that, extensions in credit and restructuring and all the rest of it. In August 2019, Donald Trump was calling for a cut in interest rates because of slowing economic growth. So we'd had 0 interest rates, 0% interest, baseline interest rates. That's basically 0% borrowing costs. So borrowing capital couldn't have been any cheaper post 2010, because that's how bad the recession in 2010 was. That to sort of get, one of the counter tendencies was to cut the price of borrowing capital, essentially. So that re-incentivized the borrowing of capital and therefore reinvestment. It usually takes a 6% cut in the baseline interest rate to end a recession, on average. So we're already at 0, and interest rates started to tick back up from 2016 very slowly. So from 0% back up to around 2.5% nearly by mid 2019. And at that point, economic growth is slowing down already, just from a fairly slight rise in interest rates. So Trump's calling for the interest rate to be cut again to make borrowing costs cheaper again. And Britain and Germany in the August of 2019 reported negative economic growth, very slight, but still a harbinger of an economic contraction, a recession. Then rates were cut, and then going into the end of 2019, rates were still being cut, and then we had COVID. So any sort of and maybe it was a coincidence. I don't know. I've said this many times, that like all of my commentary on COVID is that whatever your theory is, you can probably largely put it down to the tendencies of capitalism, which we'll go into more. But
right,
that's what I was trying to explain with my essay, and certainly, but it basically got forgotten that we were on the cusp of a recession as it was. So when we got the lockdowns and we suddenly had a very deep 2-month recession, very, very deep. It was in Britain in the March and April, the economy shrank by 25-30%, which was the worst recession since 1709. But it didn't count as a technical recession because it was only 2 months, because they started easing they went for the hard lockdown, and then after 2 months there was it was more like a semi-lockdown sort of situation, but that was kind of how it unfolded.
So how does the lockdown rationalize at this larger level in a way? Because obviously a lockdown is bad for a lot of business owners. So how is it good at this larger level for capital in general?
Yeah, so as I was saying, I was predicting a very deep economic crisis regardless of any pandemic, which means that we had a very, very large overaccumulation of capital, one that I judged to be larger than the one we had in 2008 on the basis of the debt being higher. We had record levels of private debt, record levels. So private debt has been the driver over the last 50 years of national debt, and then that private debt gets turned into national debt and heaped onto the back to the public, and resulting in ever larger financial bubbles. So because the financial bubble is getting larger, we can say that the overaccumulation of capital, this surplus glut of uninvestable, unprofitable capital, is growing larger, which means the crisis needs to be deeper than the one before to resolve that overaccumulation of capital and reconvert it into productive capital to revive the next round of accumulation on a higher level. So a lockdown induced, whether intentionally or not, induced a deep recession that accelerated the process of devaluation of large parts of the economy, and those businesses that went bust or had to reduce their prices enabled the larger companies to either buy those companies up cheaper or to buy things from them cheaper that enabled them to expand production, to innovate. And that included things like people working from home, because it cheapened the price of labor power.
Right.
Yeah. So if you're working from home, which I think you alluded to earlier,
Right.
if you're working, if your staff's working from home, your office overheads have been cut, and some of your bills are put onto the shoulders of the workers instead, because they're paying for their electricity at home, instead of you paying it at the office, and things like that. So, and Microsoft announced two years worth of innovation in 2 months, because with their staff working at home, it had increased the number of hours they were working for a start, because you can expect them to work earlier because they're not getting in a car or commuting in the morning, so that gives you an extra hour or two a day perhaps, and it just introduced sort of new efficiencies that benefited the bottom line.
New efficiencies, and it was obviously like good for Zoom, right?
Yeah, depending on what sort of company you are. Yeah,
it was good for Amazon, right?
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, like, that gave some of these companies a huge leg up over others, and they were able to kind of clear the field, right? There's all these crippled companies that they kind of were like, okay, now we're going to take you over, right? And this is, Meta took off, right? Meta is like a new level of Facebook in a sort of sense, which encapsulates so much of the internet, including Instagram and stuff like that. TikTok really took off, and so this is also part of the profitability crisis is also something inherent to platform capitalism, in the way that Nick Cernicek talks about it in the book Platform Capitalism, which is just that all of these platforms, their model is to give it away for free while people are betting on them, gaining a monopoly. And that's how PayPal won. That's how Amazon won. And that's how all these other streaming services, that's what they're competing for. Is that they're basically operating at a loss until they can get that monopoly, right? And obviously the ominous, necessary conclusion of that is that eventually they need to recoup. They need their return on investment, which means the prices will only go up over time, especially as they've made us all reliant on it. Like, I just lost my phone, or had it stolen a couple weeks ago. Gosh, it's crazy how reliant you are on the phone now that two-factor authentication is a thing everywhere. Like, if you don't have your phone, you get locked out of your everything, And so it's like, in a lot of ways, you can't even, like, I couldn't even, like, how do you get a hold of the bank, and have a conversation, tell them to turn off your card, and because it was my phone and wallet that was stolen. The whole situation was crazy, but the main thing was just, we are so reliant on on Android and Apple, and Android and Apple is basically a duopoly at this point, right? And that's kind of Baudrillard's contribution in his piece on duopoly, is that the tendency for monopolization in the in this kind of new media environment is to always give people two choices, like to always have two main choices. And so the monopoly always takes on two faces. The monopoly takes on the face of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. It takes on the face of Pepsi versus Coke. It takes on the face of Android versus Apple. Google is still kind of just like on top as far as search engines go, but they're all kind of vying to be the Amazon in whatever it is that they're serving. And so this is, we think that people tend to think critically about media in terms of, like, what is the message that is being propagated from the platform, and what is that brainwashing people to believe, or supposedly, because people are supposed to be dumb and just influenced by ideas at this sort of really dumb, a kind of level. Well, the much deeper, more critical question obviously is, yeah, but what are the parameters for social, cultural, and ideological life that are being set by material driving forces that are kind of outside of any individual's control, and arguably even outside of most, like, politicians' control, because they all work within the system in a way that's inherently incapable of actually grasping these reins or doing anything productive with it, right? But then that raises the question, though, about mediation and rationalization on the level of government. And, you bring in the bank, the central bank, and the going off the gold standard. And, there's obviously the bailouts that occur with the recessions. And right now, this my student debt being put in a hiatus, so the interest rates are not going up on it during this crisis. Like, those kinds of things mediate in a sense, right? And so the idea is that, oh, well, it's okay. There's enough mediating counter tendencies that the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, whenever it brings about these crises, like, some managerial intervention can keep the thing chugging along. And basically, you bring up this prospect of the rate of profit reaching zero. And I think that, like, what is probably lost on me and everyone else most of the time when trying to think about this stuff is, like, what does that really mean? What does it really mean for the tendency rate of profit to reach zero?
I mean, that's a good question. So if you look, just to explain that, so often we just talk about, or Marxists just talk about there being a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Some Marxists only point this out in terms of individual cycles. So they'll say by the end of the business cycle, it's fallen. But there is a historical secular fall in the rate of profit. So, for example, Esteban Maito did a study that showed that the average rate of profit fell in, like, the main economies from, I think it was 43% in the 1870s down to 17% in the 2000s. So you can see that it's consistently, progressively fallen historically, not just in a short-term cycle. So that indicates that it's trending historically towards zero. If you look at the last 700, the Bank of England released a study on the last 700 years of interest rates. It's doing the same thing. Interest is a form of profit. And again, it used to be, the average interest rates used to be a lot higher before any, before any sort of central banking system was implemented, regardless of the political or banking regimes. And so logically, historically, the rate of profit is falling towards zero, and it has been very low since the 2000s, and it hasn't really recovered. Yes, it goes up and down, but the dominant trajectory is for it to fall. So at the moment, the rate of profit has been going up since inflation, because the inflation, what's happened is several things have happened. So you had pent-up demand from COVID, from people not spending, including capitalists not spending during lockdowns. So you've got pent-up demand from that. You've got 2 years of rising bankruptcies, which causes supply chain issues, because suddenly there's fewer companies providing certain commodities. So that will have the same effect of raising demand relative to supply. Then you just have price gouging, because companies have got a low rate of profit. They've promised returns to their investors, their shareholders, that they presently can't afford. So they raise prices to rake more money in, essentially, so that they can afford to pay their dividends. Big oil companies are cutting the production or distribution of energy, again, to raise demand relative to supply, and therefore prices. So all of these factors, stemming from a rapid increase in surplus capital that arose from the lockdowns, is having the effect of inflation, and therefore raising the rate of profit. But we're now, despite that, still experiencing a slowdown in economic growth. And that is going to trigger disinflation. And when we've seen some disinflation where inflation, the rate of inflation slows down, and it's probably going to, and the central banks certainly seem to be trying to instigate a deflationary process now, because the problem with inflation is it does make things harder to buy, not just for people, but for companies as well. And it makes debt more expensive for governments. But then so do rising interest rates. So there's this massive contradiction at the moment, where the system seems to be caught between a rock and a hard place. The central banks seem to be caught between a rock and a hard place. The government seems to be caught between a rock and a hard place. But you know, they need a deflationary crisis, because, as I say, every crisis, every recession is resolved by a recession, which is a deflationary price process, where prices fall, and that enables reinvestment, because things get cheaper to buy. So the rate of profit will have to, it's gone up thanks to inflation, but that's unsustainable. It has to come back down. And as I say, it's already been very low for the past, at least 15 years. So if it drops lower than that still, logically it's heading at least towards an ever closer to zero.
Ooh, so that lays the conditions then and builds a case for a radical restructuring of things. And that's obviously what you call for. That's what you're interested in. That is your political goals, is that there would be a radical restructuring of society. Is that right?
Well, yeah. So I think socialism is a historical inevitability and necessity, because I think capitalism essentially lays the groundwork for it. There's this process of historical devaluation that is unsustainable. Like, capital can't be devalued forever, because a rate of profit is also a a rate of profit falling to zero is also a process of things becoming free, and in terms of the economic tendency. And that's what socialism is going to be, in terms of um, your energy will be free, your health care will be free. Um, it's not going to be about profit anymore. It's not you're not going to buy things so that companies can make a profit. We're going to be building a system where we can sustain ourselves, where we can produce for ourselves. That's the real definition of freedom for me. Is not that I have to go and work for an employer so that I can then go and buy their products. It's that I can produce for myself, which doesn't cost me money because I'm producing for myself. We can go into a bit more detail about that to make it clearer. But yeah, you have this historical process of devaluation that eventually makes capitalism historically redundant, and makes socialism an economic necessity. And with monopolization, this is another sign of it, because eventually you have to have a process towards a total monopoly, or what you might term a final merger. Eventually you're going to run out of companies to merge with, sort of thing. So that, and within private enterprise, we see an increasing level of central planning. So they've increasingly, during the neoliberal period, eliminated internal markets, which means there's no competition between departments within companies, which is another form of rationalization. If you read the book, The People's Republic of Walmart, that lays it out very clearly. Like a company like Walmart is increasingly centrally planned because it's cheaper and more efficient to produce and distribute commodities, including things like centralized databases. Like, why would you have decentralized databases competing against each other or duplicating figures and data? If you centralize it, it's more efficient. You don't make those sort of mistakes. That's what's happening. And so all of these tendencies show that, it seems to me very clear that we have a very strong tendency towards socialism. Does that mean it just happens without us having to take some sort of political stance? No, I'm not saying that. I think all of these tendencies, though, are raising our consciousness. We're seeing it all unfold, and that, along with the economic crises and breakdown, which makes most of us poorer, serves as the impetus for a new political movement that is a movement for socialism.
And what happens if it's not socialism?
Well, until it's socialism, it's a worsening form of capitalism. So you essentially, so the big thing at the big underlying factor in capitalism is fossil fuel. Fossil fuel has been essential in the last century or so for capitalism's reproduction, because it's a labor-intensive form of production. It's non-renewable, so once we burn it, it disappears into thin air. You then have to employ labor to reproduce it through the labor-intensive process of extracting it from the ground. And yes, it's become an increasingly capital intensive form of production, but the production of that capital intensiveness has always depended on labor and the intensification of labor in terms of the rate of exploitation. So we're now in a situation where it's become so capital intensive because we're digging deep. We have to keep digging deeper for the fossil fuel, that fossil fuel is becoming unprofitable. And the only way it sustains its profitability is through public subsidies, which is making everyone poorer. And public subsidies are not a bottomless reservoir, because if you immiserate everyone, then there's nowhere for those public subsidies to come from. So the trajectory of capitalism is that it's a decaying system. It is unsustainable economically, and in terms of its energy supply. So we're gonna end up with less energy and less production amid a growing population. So we're heading towards and we've experienced it in the last 20 years anyway, a relative increase in immiseration, which at some point has to tip over into an absolute decrease in living standards, if that hasn't already happened.
I think it is happening in the United States. I mean, coming to Mexico made that clear. You know, the middle class consumer culture in Mexico is much more alive and well than it is in the United States right now, right? Like that was the primary culture shock. Like, you know, being in a place with poor plumbing and not being able to flush toilet paper, like that was a culture shock the first time I experienced it when abroad. But that was not shocking when I came here for the first time. The only thing that was genuinely shocking was to see people of seemingly diverse class backgrounds all out and about every day eating food. Like in Boise, Idaho, you go downtown and the only people you see eating food are, they probably went to college. Like it's not like people don't just go out and eat food and hang out and talk, and it's not, and then people blame smartphones. They have their role, but obviously like people just can't go out and do things the way that they used to be able to do when there was more to go around, right? And so you know, I mean the crow, what, how does that, they always return to roost? How does that
chickens coming home to roost?
Chickens come home to roost. Yeah, and economically, they always will, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It's nice right now in Mexico. Enjoy it while it lasts, you know. And it's not nice everywhere in Mexico. Not every state is as secure or as prosperous as Aguascalientes, obviously. But yeah, no, it's actually wild to me. I've never been in a place where everyone's just like, there's so much shopping going on, and a lot of it's for just delicious food, and it's like that's not happening in the States right now. And you know, hearing stories from my compatriot Michael talks about like in the 80s, like just everyone was at the mall, and everyone was at, you know, Outback Steakhouse and Applebee's, and everyone was eating all the time. And now you go to these restaurants and they're very rarely crowded, right? And it's just like people just don't have that. And so, you know, this for some people living at a certain income level, they might not really notice it because they're kind of just in their own little worlds. But for a lot of people, it's like, yeah, you feel it at a spiritual level if you're not able to get together with friends and do stuff. Like, people go, oh, you want to go out to the coffee shop? And I'm sitting here thinking, what, so that I have to spend $10 to eat like a muffin and have a cup of black coffee? Like, that's the situation right now. It's insane how expensive things are. And so, you know, you shouldn't be factoring, we're talking about a muffin and some coffee. Like, that should not be factoring in if I actually want to meet up with somebody when they're inviting me out somewhere, right? So that's the way it impacts us at the level of immediate experience. But the bigger problem for me, I mean, it's a problem for everybody, I think, but it's the problem that I focus on, is like why the left is fundamentally incapable of delivering on its promises, pursuing its values, winning in any way. And, you know, that kind of theory that tries to understand why it's not winning and why it's not really capable of winning. Obviously, there's like this level where it's like, yeah, well, on the left, like nobody's talking about this. People were just blaming people who, it's the people who don't wear masks. It's all their fault. Now we have these supply chain issues. Oh, it's the, you know, the addition of the money supply. It's all that. It's all the fault of the Democrats for doing that. So you have both sides blaming one another, right? While at the same time, everything the two sides are doing is its own competing form of rationalization to actually mediate this contradiction in a way that enhances social control over everybody, right? And so, I mean, that's where my sympathies lie with the people who are super anti-lockdown, is because no amount of, and by the way, at this point, it's okay. We've already been flagged on the algorithms. Like this stuff is, no one is going to be recommended this video because of this conversation. Like, in a sort of sense, we've just shit in the we pissed in the pool. Everybody else's segments talking about other kinds of theory on this marathon stream is now going to get blacklisted on YouTube because we're talking about this stuff, right? And so this is the concern for me, is that not only has the left like lost the plot when it comes to everything related to this. I mean, everyone's lost the plot, but more importantly, the kind of control that has been seized as a way of rationalizing the situation. No, I'm not just talking about like the normalization of social distancing and all of this stuff. No, it's not just sending people home and everything like that. It's specifically epistemological gaslighting and social blackmail being put forward as the mode of activism by people who are on all over the left. Like the left as a journalist / media commentary entity existing online for the last 3 years has been one that almost entirely takes for granted the idea that epistemologically gaslighting and social blackmailing regular working people is the solution to a pandemic, right? And what I mean by epistemological gaslighting is shut the fuck up, don't question this, you just need to go along with it. If you don't go along with it, you're the bad person. The you're the bad person part is the social blackmail part, because the logical conclusion of it is if you don't play along and nod your head and say, oh yeah, experts know best, you know, then you're going to be scapegoated. It's actually your fault now. In fact, all of these other problems are actually now your fault, and you're part of they'll associate you with everything bad in the world. And so that sort of, and I'm not saying like epistemological gaslighting is it's just a response to conspiracy theorists. I'm saying it's something that's put forward by the media onto everybody for the last couple of years. And it's for me the biggest, and it's primarily on the left, right? The supposed left, it's primarily coming from like the Democrats, at least in the United States, and obviously a lot of their little radical children who are on YouTube, right? And so the issue for me is that if we're approaching a 0 point and things could be free, if there was such a thing as socialism, then what I fear that is most in the way are the very people who advocate for socialism, because the mode that they're in is this gaslighting, blackmailing, meritocratic, censorious, PMC fucking mode that has been, it's been around for it's been around since, at least the 60s. And it's only gotten worse over time, but it's become pronounced since 2020, especially with the burnout that followed from Bernie kind of folding. And when he did, the people who stepped forward were the people who were anti-universalist, don't think about bigger structural changes at all, pretty much just focused on BLM and COVID lockdowns. And so that's the world that I think we're living in. And for me, I feel like we're fucked. And so I want to put that back onto a question from you, because I think you also have your pretty dark, sort of black-pilled sort of moments about things, but you also have hope. And I'm hoping that you can share a little bit of that with us before we pivot into the broader Q&A portion of this conversation. But there is Matan in the chat on the Zoom side raised a counterpoint that I feel like goes right with my question, which is, he said, instead of laying the groundwork for socialism, what if we end up with a neo-feudalism and a new era of barbarism? Right, like in a sort of sense, you already maybe you suggested that we're kind of already there, but I just kind of want to hear like what is your do you challenge anything that I've kind of said so far? Do you kind of do you majorly depart from it in any significant ways, and how do you see hope?
So firstly, on the neo-feudalism thing, I don't see what's happening as a development into neo-feudalism. Feudalism is a redundant mode of production that is tied to agriculture. It's not just about, rents and things like that. I know that this has become a thing with Yanis Varoufakis and some others on the left.
Joel Kotkin wrote a book called Neo-Feudalism, yeah.
Yeah, Jodie Dean as well has been talking about it. It's just monopoly rents. It's monopolies not being able to live off profits that comes from production, because production is becoming automated and abolishing the source of profit, which is the exploitation of labor or commodity producing labor. And therefore they have to get their profit from somewhere else, which is by redistributing money upwards from the classes below through the tax system and through rents and subscriptions. And that's what's happening. It's just capitalism in decay. So that's why I don't characterize it as neo-feudalism. Barbarism, yes, barbarism has existed throughout the history of private property. There's that, who is it, Walter Benjamin, with the quote about civilization, wherever you find civilization, you find barbarism. I might have that wrong. But a lot of capitalism is built on high rates of exploitation, on colonialism, on war. So there's always been barbarism within capitalism. It just changes in degree and geographically and so on and so forth. So I absolutely expect the end of capitalism will be increasingly barbaric to one degree or another. The aim is obviously to limit that level of barbarism. I mean, like you say, people are going hungry already. In America, we've seen a spike in homelessness and increasing levels of hunger here in Britain, and we want to overhaul the system and introduce a system that eliminates homelessness and hunger, and we want to do that as quickly as possible, so that there's a limit to the amount of barbarism that capitalism produces. So where I see hope is in the people, is in going to the people and trying to build solidarity and raise consciousness about all the things we've talked about. And I think that, there's a dialectical relationship between practice and reality. And the practice is that their living conditions are falling, and that means they're more likely to listen to and absorb and grasp the theory in a way that they might not have done in the past when things were a bit better, because that's just the way history tends to unfold. In terms of the left, yeah, I mean, the left has, from a Marxist perspective, the left, generally speaking, has been a privileged layer of the working class that basically has an alliance with either what you would call the middle class or an even more privileged layer of the working class, or just, ultimately it's a pact with capital. That's what social democracy is. It's a compromise between some section of the working class and the capitalist class. So while the capitalist class is able to buy off that layer of the working class, and it has elements of a privileged layer of the working class, as a layer from the middle classes and from the smaller capitalist class. And so long as the capitalist system is able to fund them, and their activities, and afford this compromise, then ultimately, no matter how critical the left is of capitalism or of the government or whoever they're criticizing, ultimately that compromise is in place. And so they'll only go so far in their criticism or in the solutions that they propose. And so the solutions they propose are limited to expanding the state through a sort of minimal nationalization program, because that secures their employment, for example. And I'm not doubting that they have good intentions a lot of the time and want to see a larger proportion of the population doing better. But yeah, that's basically, at the moment, that's where they draw the line.
Okay, that's fascinating. So I guess the reason that this is a problem for me is because outside of you and like 3 other Marxists I know, I don't tend to like or trust Marxists, much less the obviously more naive progressivist, liberal left, social democrat types. I like your critique of capitalism, and I think that I can appreciate that you have hope, but my fear trumps my hope, in the sense that it's like, yeah, I have hope. I have genuine hope, in the sense that there are several ways forward that I can see. I can't see very far, but I think that there are certain things people can do that make definite differences, and they're not just consumer choices, I think. And I think that you're right, that we both have the same enemy in sight. That it is primarily capital, except that there is this more daunting future, this barbarism masquerading under the guise of socialism, that it's not. A Nancy Pelosi calling herself a socialist would still be a Nancy Pelosi, right? And the thing that I'm worried about is primarily that with everything I've seen, as long as I've been engaged politically, in mostly Bernie activism, but I was also kind of a bystander to Occupy and kind of aware of what was going on there, and I've also watched other movements rise and fall, and the through line is one of this censorious, if you don't kind of nod along and do the things and say the stuff that we want, we're going to unperson you and harass you, or at least justify and rationalize those who harass you, to the ends of the earth and for the rest of all time. And that's just because you're going to be persona non grata, and that's the end of it. And so, because that is like the mode, and it's part and parcel to what I'm calling discursive Taylorism, right? People who monopolize certain conversation lanes and say, you can't even talk on this, you shouldn't speak on this, you don't have any business speaking on this. Discursive Taylorism tending to operate in terms of epistemological gaslighting and social blackmail makes me think that any, say DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, or some radical faction of it, or something that gets into the Democratic Party, or something that operates outside of that and creates a big movement or whatever, so long as the basic mode and presuppositions of the last, well, as long as I've been conscious, are operative, then what would social control over the means of production actually entail? It would actually entail these very people having the levers of power over where I work, when I work, for how long. And so things would be free, as would be my labor. So I would have free electricity, and I would have free housing, so long as I was giving away my labor for free in exchange to that. So when you say that, neofeudalism, feudalism is based on agriculture. Well, yeah, but the word neo means a new kind of feudalism. And so we're talking about something based on some other kind of economy, right? Where basically, my labor is just taken for free. And what I'm given in return for free is far less than the value of what's being taken from me. And so what I need to see is some kind of an assurance that that's not going to happen. And because I can't see that, I just lack the radical imagination to see it. And that lack of radical imagination is not based on my inability to go out in the world and be around other workers. It's not based on my inability to go out and be in organizing spaces. It's a result of having done that, right? And so for me, it's like, my main thing is like, I don't want you to give up your hope. I want you to take the word back to your comrades. This is the biggest problem, is their trustworthiness, or the idea that they think that we should trust them. And then what we ultimately need is some kind of instead of transparent structure so that we know it's going to serve everybody instead of just a handful of people, some kind of I don't really know if this is an impossible ask, but like a post-trust system. When we're regular working class people who are so disillusioned on being told you have to trust this person, or you have to trust this group, or you have to trust this party, don't have to. The material changes are there. We know we're getting more in return than we're giving, and it's awesome. But like, what we need is like, I know that like Marx said, we can't have people doing cook shops in the mind for like utopia, basically. Like we just need to make the change. But it's also like, I don't know, when it comes to my inability to imagine at this more radical level, due to my disillusionment, I basically just have to go, I really want people to get better at kind of addressing that fundamental distrust. Because what I see at this moment is that we live in a time of distrust, that conspiracy theories are symptomatic of living in a post-trust world, where the expert class has told everyone else, well, if you don't just follow us, you're the problem, right? And so I know I'm kind of throwing a lot of impossible asks at you right now, and I don't really expect any kind of grand solution from you, but I just kind of wanted you to have a sense for where I'm coming from, and that I'm not giving up on the sense that I think critique of political economy and everything that you're doing is still the most important thing. And I think that if there is a way out, it's going to, in part, involve understanding where you're coming from.
Yeah, totally. And I understand where you're coming from. I mean, the Marxist position is to oppose the left, as in the social democratic left, or the Labour aristocracy, or whatever you want to call it. There can be things we work together on if we agree on particular things, but we never do those things, on the basis of, we must also support them electorally, for example. if they say, well, we're only going to work with you if you support us electorally, no, we're not going to do that, because we're not here for that. We're here to improve the conditions of the working class, even if it's on the basis of winning this one particular reform that's going to improve the conditions of the working class. And for Marxists, that's how we try to build up trust. We don't just go, oh, you can only join us if you're in this for the revolution. We also going to fight for reforms that improve, even if it's just independent organization, that for workers, that help the workers to have a stronger material basis for their own reproduction. We want to get involved with that and help develop that. That's what Soviets were. That's what workers' councils were. Those were established in crisis conditions so that people could survive. And Marxists didn't go, oh, well, this isn't socialism, we're not going to support this. They went and worked with it and gradually won people over who were fighting in those situations to the side of the Marxist position. In terms of the left, I was opposed to lockdowns and mandates, and anyone on the left who was supporting mandates and lockdowns, I was criticising. So people have to draw their own conclusions. Was I right to do that? Could you trust me when I was saying that was my position? That people have to make their own minds up ultimately on the basis of what they see and hear and how they assess it. If you didn't like people on the left who supported mandates and lockdowns, find people on the left or the Marxist left or whoever who didn't support lockdowns and mandates. So it's very difficult because, as you say, there's a lot of different trends and a lot of bickering that's exhausting and what have you. But if you find yourself in a position where you need to organise and you feel like you need to band together with people, find people that you agree with and who want to work towards the same goal, but don't do it at the exclusion of people that you never agree with or that you disagree with on several issues, depending on the situation. I'll elaborate on that in a minute if you want.
No, I think that there's a lot of directions that we could go with this and a lot of ways that we could elaborate and really add on to kind of help people understand where we're coming from and why it's a sort of contradiction or a deadlock and whatever. But I think what might be more beneficial at this point was kind of what was promised, which is a sort of Q&A portion of the conversation, because I know that Dan has some really good questions. I know that Matan has some really good questions. If Nance is around, he tends to have some really good feedback. And Adam, maybe he'll be around as well. I don't know if Michał in Poland has his internet back yet. I was hoping he would be able to join for the Q&A portion of this because he was really excited to catch you in dialogue with me. And so he's also the next guest on the stream. And so if we do get some overlap there, that would be awesome. But, he's also got this material situation without internet. So I think he's tuning in from his phone, but I'm guessing he has limited data that he can even use. And so I'm guessing he probably can't do everything from his phone. Michael, if you're watching right now, then Michał, it's the same name. But yeah, Michael, if you're watching right now, then I hope that you're able to get on for the Q&A portion of this and also for the stream. But also, I understand, like, if you have limited data and the Wi-Fi is not back yet, just let us know in the chat if you're still here and if you've heard this. But with that said, anything you would like to say before we kind of turn it over to Q&A here, Ted?
No, let's go for it, because I can't stay too much longer. So let's get into that.
Like 20 minutes or so, or
Yeah,
okay.
20's cool.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So if you're in the Zoom side, go ahead and turn your camera on. Um, uh, and first come, first serve, really. Go for it. By the way, nice to see you, Dan. Nice to meet you for the first time. This is, I believe, your first time on stream, so.
Yeah, no, I think it's first time on stream. Although I've been on the For They Know Not, they do reading groups. I don't know if I've ever actually spoken up there though. Can you hear me okay?
Cool. Yeah, we can hear you just great.
Great. So a question that I had asked like a while back when the discussion was about the low rate of profit, but I think is still applicable, is at what point does the low rate of profit suggest that the form of expropriation is extra economic or non-economic? And this is just to give you sort of background. This is related to I read a book by Ellen Makesons Wood called The Origins of Capitalism. She talks about it as coming from like the agricultural competition that it started to occur in England. But I guess the key thing being it required compulsion to like engage in like increase of productivity and like price competition in markets. Whereas if it's strictly rent based, then it's less so that somebody has to like actually compete. If you have a monopoly, you're not price competing. I also made a comment. Basically, a lot of large tech companies buy up small tech companies to kill them off to even prevent any form of development of competition. And so basically all this is suggest in the sense of like the neo-feudalism, like, okay, yes, it's not based on agriculture, but the key thing is it's not actually based on markets and competition. Sorry. So what I started with was something about like, the low rate of profit, like what does it suggest? And initially it was just like, at what point does like a low rate of profit for long enough suggest like maybe this isn't really capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, so we had free market or free competition in the sort of lower phase of capitalism that wasn't monopoly capitalism, wasn't imperialism, or wasn't described as such. So we've been in the monopoly phase of capitalism, which has sort of increasingly strangled competition and increasingly merged markets. So we kind of have this tendency towards fewer markets but increased competition in terms of the intensification of the competition between the remaining competitors. There's fewer competitors, but they're more powerful economically. And because the crisis of profitability is deeper, the competition is sharper. It's hard to say. It's hard to say because like with a breakdown of capitalism, things can start to go backwards. Obviously, we see that politically for a start. And even when we have economic growth, we see that's based on a centralization of capital, i.e., a redistribution of wealth upwards. So all these things are happening, and like I say, it's going to take a socialist movement to sort of confirm, to consummate a breakdown of capitalism in terms of advancing the productive forces to the next stage. But capitalists are still at the moment incentivized to innovate because that cheapens production and raises profit margins. So they're going to switch their investment to something that's more productive, and what's more productive produces more, and therefore cheapens the amount of profit in each commodity. So I don't see this tendency going away. I don't see like any capitalists who kind of like try to revert to old technological means, for example, which did happen in Nazi Germany to some extent in some areas, that's going to raise costs and therefore deepen the economic crisis, which can serve as an impetus to radicalization. So I mean, this is why I do think, obviously the barriers to socialism are extreme, could be extreme, and the rate of progress that we make it could be incredibly difficult. But this is why I do see all roads leading to socialism eventually, even if my timing is off or it's not on the horizon as soon as maybe I perhaps thought. Whatever way capitalism goes, it's going to have a radicalizing effect on a larger and larger proportion of the population in the long run. So yeah, I mean, the monopoly rents thing is, as I say, it's a deepening of parasitism. Like, capitalism is a parasitical mode of production as it is, because capital lives like a parasite on labor. And then when that expropriation of surplus value isn't enough, just at the point of production, that parasitism finds other ways to increase the amount of surplus labor time that's being taken away from labor. And as I say, that can happen through the tax system. It can happen through making you pay more for your subscription or introducing a new subscription that you weren't paying before. So that I see that as a deepening of current capitalist tendencies. I don't know if that really answers the question.
I mean, I definitely feel like you were trying to address it. I guess I feel like the key contention I'm making is that the rents are not actually like economic competition. The rents and that more of it, at least certainly in the developed world, like you can make the argument like in non-first world countries, they still are like trying to do like more productive things. Like, for instance, you brought up the notion like we're not going to revert to less productive processes, but for instance, that my contention isn't that like, hey, we're going back to sort of like rural agrarian society. My contention is that the things that we rely upon, the technologies, like we'll have to pay Google, $1,000 a year, everyone, just to have, search capabilities, just to be able to say like, well, what was that thing that I was doing at that time, right? And so we're,
anyway,
the point is more. Good.
I'm not saying that won't happen. I just don't characterize it as a different system. I just think it's capitalism necessarily becoming even more parasitic to reproduce itself.
And so what I'm trying to link it to is that during feudalism, right, before capitalism, you had to pay some fraction of your harvest as rent to your lord or whatever, and you didn't really have a choice. Like, some people couldn't even like move from the land, and in a lot of ways we don't necessarily have that many choices. Like, some people, for instance, like have no choice of their data provider. Some people, in the future, and there's a lot less competition in search engines, and in the future, anyways, I don't mean to belabor it, but I guess I'm just trying to point more towards, we don't have that much choice about these things that we rely upon. We can't even necessarily move from like lord to lord, and that ultimately the reason why they even have that power is because like that is like property is like backed by like the force of the state, which is not, it's not about like, Google is competing with Yahoo for search results. It's like there's really just like the one, or anyways, yeah. So I feel like I need to work to sort of like better identify why it is that I don't think that it is capitalism and link it to the state of things as they were like during feudalism. Although I'm not claiming, right? It's, it is like the neo-feudalism in the terms of, I think it was like Dave who brought it up. It's like it's a different form of thing, but it is still sort of like, we must pay like this rent to these parties that we don't really get to choose.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. And certainly the character of capitalism would be different, at least at the surface level. And I think we should probably continue this conversation in more depth another time. But my fundamental argument is that the source of value isn't changing. The essential source of value, which is the exploitation of labor in terms of surplus labor time that is appropriated from labor and then realized in the commodity, is still the fundamental essence of value in the system, but these rents are being introduced on a much worse basis to basically offset falling profitability.
All right. Do we have another hand up? I think we do. It's Matan.
Yes. So I agreed with your point about increasing political radicalization in the face of subjective destitution. And I have a more open-ended question in response to that, which is how do you conceive political subjectivity in the face of this breaking political order or social order?
So what direction do I think the general public is going politically? Is that what you mean?
However you perceive it.
Okay, well, I mean, that's so complicated.
No, that's a really big question. Yeah.
Sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry. I said, yeah, that's a really big question for sure.
You don't have much time. I kind of wanted to provoke you a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I was discussing this with a comrade yesterday. Yeah, it's complex because it's not just the working class versus the capitalist class. There are intermediary classes or overlapping classes, and there's divides within the working class culturally and socially and generationally to some extent. So ultimately we have to try and simplify our message as capitalism is exhausting itself and we're only going to fix this and get living standards back to where they should be and beyond with socialism. But that's obviously, it's hard to communicate that, and we have to teach ourselves to communicate that. I'm not saying I'm doing it particularly well or anything, but yeah, people will, without that information, they could go in a direction that doesn't even serve their own interests.
And I would kind of add that this direction that people might choose instead of political radicalization, it often, Lou, relies on sort of personal identifications, which sort of ignore the fact that they're in a burning building. So I agree with the fact that you have hope, but rather than framing it as hope to build socialism, perhaps it should be hope that we have the freedom to decide to jump out of this burning building before it collapses.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting way of putting it. Totally. Yeah, I mean the burning building serves as the impetus for making a decision, and what are you going to decide to do? And then who's outside directing you to, somewhere better, sort of thing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to let you say some closing remarks here in a second, but I also want to just see, Nance, you've been the all-seeing eye overlooking the, chat for this entire time, being the, mod boss over here. So just maybe, do you have anything to relay from that, or from your own personal thoughts? I mean, you've read Reese before. You've been along for the whole marathon so far, and so, I mean, this is kind of like this is like a different wheelhouse that just got thrown into the mix, and I'm curious about your perspective or thoughts on it, because I think that could be really cool. So if you got anything, we want to hear it.
This is probably a silly question. I just wonder if now that there really aren't workers that can kind of step away and bring everything crashing down, but there are kind of consumers and maybe data producers that everything kind of rests on, does that change anything? That it's not labor power that's productive anymore. It's consumption and maybe passive data production. Or is that?
I mean, a lot of data production is productive in terms of value. It's just that it produces so little of it relative to the amount of capital that needs to be reproduced. And that's why the system needs so much data, like just absolutely almost unquantifiable amounts. The thing with that is capitalism's becoming more dependent on data producers. So I do think that's something to think about that I haven't quite figured out yet. But it seems, the forms of labor evolve over time, generationally and technically. And so new forms of labor are replacing older forms of labor throughout history. And at some point, there is going to be a form of labor related to automation that becomes the socialist form of labor, because what we have is a new economic technical basis that's evolved, and capital and society are both becoming increasingly dependent on that economic technical basis and the labor that reproduces it. So there's only so far the data producers and the other new forms of labor can be pushed, and we don't know what those limits are yet. But yeah, I think that's a really important question to struggle with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It kind of goes along with, we really just don't know what discoveries in both bioengineering and like asteroid mining might do to mediate these tendencies as well, and like really prolong various crises is a way of saying it. So
yeah, basically always try and think dialectically, like the new forms of technical labor can prolong a crisis, but they can at the same time do the opposite. And like I tend to talk about capitalism as a whole, but different sectors of the economy will be growing at points when larger or other parts of the economy might be shrinking. So there's that sort of thing, like small startups can become tomorrow's monopolies just because they have an innovation that's more efficient than the monopolies of yesterday had.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for spending so much time here in the hot seat, Ted. I think you've done a stellar job, and really appreciate your increasing clarity and succinctness regarding this theory, and it's just one of those things where it's like, it's amazing to me how people who are kind of relativists or sort of perspectivists, like they think that every theory should be just a tool in the toolkit to apply to everything. these people tend to leave out the most important tool developed at the very beginning and continued on throughout all of theory, really, and that is critique of political economy. And so thank you for keeping it alive. Thank you for holding the line. And I look forward to having you back in the future.
Thanks very much for having me on, and stellar work yourself with the ultimate marathon, as far as I can tell, for online debates.
You know, it's this one wasn't the debate one, but I am thinking about for when I'm thinking I'm going to do another marathon for the app launch, and I'm thinking about calling it Contradictions, and that's where I'm going to bring on you and Kangaroo, Swole and Christine Louis Dussoli, Nina Power and Daniel Tutt. Fucking maybe I should bring you and Kotkin on, you know. But it just I think that there's a lot, like, more important than getting people, from my standpoint, more important than people coming to a specific conclusion is getting them to take things seriously and work through contradictions for themselves. And so, like, I think that you are one of the people who makes that possible. So thank you.
Thanks a lot for having me on, and I look forward to the next time.
All right, take care.
You too. Thanks, everyone.
And now a quick message from our sponsors. Just kidding. This will be neither quick nor from any corporate or state sponsorship.
What's up, everybody? Thank you so much for watching all the way through. The fact that you made it to the end means you get a gold star. Yeah. What I'm going to do with this little bit of time remaining at the end is give you the quick rundown on everything. I'm kind of assuming an audience of people who are not reading all the emails that I send out, who are not registered with Theory Underground, who are not taking ongoing courses at Theory Underground. And so you might be someone who's come to the channel for the first time, in which case you probably just think that this is a YouTube, in which case, well, of course, you're partially correct, but mostly wrong. Because if you look right here, what I have is a course site. It is its own platform on theory-underground.com. But it's not just courses. These courses are gateways to a bigger and more important conversation that is just getting started. And really, after this next month that I'm taking off to get married and to go on a honeymoon, once I get back, the conversation and the events really kick into gear. There's going to be a national tour that will have a sort of international component, not just because it's online, but also because we will be going into Canada, Mexico, as well as potentially Europe. So stay tuned. I mean, we've been invited to Hong Kong. There's talk about going to Thailand. But it's kind of dependent on the people who reach out to us and talk to us, because this is all word of mouth and DIY. I'm not doing marketing. I'm not really trying to pursue new clicks through the algorithm outside of basic cooperation kinds of projects that I do with people like Todd McGowan, Chris Catrone, Nina Power, Daniel Tutt, etc. The point of doing what I'm doing with all of them is to say, yes, this is a part of a bigger conversation. This is this is beside everything going on with the media left and TheoryTube and Theorygram and all of those other things that are happening in the theory scene. But what I hope to establish through Theory Underground is a more rigorous and hybrid, sustained kind of dialogue with the people who are really serious about the life of the mind. And so, that means not just watching videos here and there and then telling other people, oh, I've got opinions, and then these videos say something about me, but instead drilling down into fundamental concepts, questions, problems, tracing out the contours and inherent constitutive contradictions of the fields that we are in. And so what I hope to see come out of the theory scene is an intellectual milieu. But this can't just happen overnight. It happens over time. And these courses are just to be a part of that unfolding. Most of these have already happened. So, Mikey teaches Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do. While he's teaching that course, I was simultaneously demonstrating how to be an active, critical, engaged student, right? And I did this exact same thing with the What is Sex course, where really it was Cadell Last from Philosophy Portal who was heading up everything, but it was me who was kind of modeling that student. But I also have co-instructed some courses here, like the Professional Managerial Class Consciousness and Ideology course that I co-instructed with Elton L.K. of the Working Class Intelligentsia and the Dead Parrots Philosophical Society. Elton L.K., great guy, love him. But, he's just one of these people who are in my organic intellectual milieu sort of network. And then the people that have come in through the virtual have an opportunity to ground out into that organic network by meeting up with us on tour. A couple of other people in that organic network who are here from the very beginning, and I've done stuff with them with a lot of other previous projects, was Brian Weeks and Ann Snellgrove, who are co-instructors for the Idea of the University course right here, which was the first course launched at Theory Underground. But if you want to meet some of us, if you want to actually ground out in the organic network, if you want to actually break through the walls that kind of come with these media form and actually get the vibe, you'll want to meet us in real life, in person. And we are prioritizing the people who are reaching out to us and filling out the form for the Theory Underground US Tour 2023. And so if you go to the tab on the website, on the header called events, you go to the drop down for US Tour 2023, then you can fill out this form here, and then there's a high likelihood that we'll try to do one of our events in person wherever you are at. And so we're trying to add only real people who are serious about meeting in real life, because if you prefer to stay in the role of a consumer, of someone who just kind of subscribes to content and clicks on it whenever you're just kind of distracted from whatever you're doing, that's totally fine. But if you're actually looking to get to another level of discourse where it's not just we're talking at each other, but instead we are in a field and we actually have reference in that field that go beyond just idle chatter, then you'll want to get involved with this for sure. So that's the main thing. I wanted to tell you that once I come back from the honeymoon and the time away for the wedding, the events are really going to kick off. The tour is going to be what I'm focusing most of my energy on. But at the same time that the tour launches, so too will 2 books be published from Theory Underground. One is my book, Timenergy, and the other book is Underground Theory. There will be big names such as Slavoj Žižek, Norman Finkelstein, Todd McGowan, Alenka Zupancic, as well as Nina Power, Daniel Tutt, Chris Catrone, and a lot of nobodies like me. Just people who have either dropped out of the university system or never even enrolled, who are nonetheless passionate about studying theory as a way of life. That's what this book is. It's 31 contributors towards underground theory, as well as critical media theory, ideology critique, the left and its critique, and there's even some essays in there on historical interpretation and the history of philosophy. So these 2 books, the Underground Theory book as well as my Timenergy book, will be published and available September 1st. And that's basically when we kick off the tour. So if you want us to come to a city near you and talk about these books or do any kind of an event, then reach out, fill out the form. And as far as Timenergy goes, you can see right here, I've actually got the Timenergy course is now listed. This course is going to begin in September. So if you've been interested in the concept of time energy, if you're interested in a deep dive through the history of philosophy, drawing from philosophers as ancient as Aristotle through to more modern metaphysicians of time like Bergson or Kant, then this is definitely for you. But if you're even more interested in abstract time and domination through someone like Moïse Pistone, a sort of post-Marxist, or actually Marx, Bourdieu, Foucault. We could talk about disciplinary time, existential time. We're going to bring in Adorno. We're going to bring in Nietzsche, Arendt. This course is going to be going through the history of philosophy, mostly focusing on time, but also leisure and freedom as fundamental concepts, and developing time energy as a sort of immanent critique of many of these philosophers and many of these theorists, and of pretty much the entire political scene as it currently exists. And so this will not be a super intensive course. You're not going to be assigned entire books to read. There will just be a monthly lecture, sort of seminar lecture, as well as a monthly check-in kind of discussion group, right? And that discussion group is one that's going to happen very much like the critical media theory reflection cohort discussion group that's currently also ongoing. So if you are not already signed up with the critical media theory research cohort, then you'll definitely want to get signed up with this time energy research cohort, because it's going to be arguably as good or better than the critical media theory one. But both of these courses are not too intensive. Both are ongoing, and it's never too late to join the critical media theory one either, right? We've already gotten a bunch of signups 2 months after the fact, because this isn't something that will just end in 6 months. We're going to repeat it. And for the people who join late, they actually get to be in the next one as well. So get involved with the time energy course and the critical media theory course. Same thing goes with the being in time course. We're reading all the way through Martin Heidegger's Being in Time as one of the most profound, difficult, and important deconstructions and critiques of everything that we take to heart, that we presuppose just taking for granted as natural, as subjects of modernity. This is what we do. And Heidegger is one of the greatest enemies of modernity, as is obviously Friedrich Nietzsche. And so both of them are the kinds of frenemies of any serious thinker who's trying to interrogate their own most closely held presuppositions, right? And so if you've ever thought about taking on a challenge like reading Being in Time all the way through, then it's not too late. You can actually still enroll in this course, and you can do the reading on your own for Division 1 over this next month. And then once you're caught up and you've gone through the lectures for Division 1, Division 2 will actually begin once I get back in mid-August. Okay? So there's a tour, there's books, there's courses. What more could I possibly add? There's an app. And that's been something that has taken a lot of my energy and effort away from Theory Underground as a website. It's because I've been mostly problem solving the app for the last few months. But what I'm currently showing up on the screen here are tickets. Every time there's an error with the website or my app, I have to open a support ticket with someone who's responsible down the line for figuring out how to problem solve the bugs. And so I've opened 1 million tickets. As you can see on the screen, these are tickets that I opened between basically mid-July and the beginning of May. But then I can go back, and I'm just showing you on the screen all of these different tickets, almost as a way of showing off that I've been doing constant troubleshooting in the background, because I'm on the fly learning how to operate and run not just like the sort of ins and outs of a course-based or course-gated social media site, but more importantly, that I'm building the actual platform, and that I'm doing it where I have to troubleshoot everything with programmers, a team of programmers. And it's all good preparation for what I hope will happen as Theory Underground gets a little bit more steam over the course of the next year. Eventually, I'll have a dedicated team of programmers, not people who are like these people, divided between 1 million different tickets that they are problem solving, but instead having my own dedicated team. Anyway, so the app, right now all I'm showing you is that there's a lot of support tickets opened, but we've actually reached a point now where I think that the app is about to go out. And if you're curious about that, just know that It's going to have like the capabilities for you to be able to message people who are on Theory Underground, for you to be able to partake in the forums and social groups, including the multilingualism, language learning clubs, as well as the film club. But more importantly, it will be a way to subscribe on a monthly basis so that you have access to everything going on at Theory Underground. Not just all the courses, not just all the conversations, but also all of these B-side specials that we've been doing. These are not listed on the regular website. They're not listed on the YouTube channel. They're specifically reserved for people who are subscribers, who are really plugged into the kind of ongoing conversation. And so if you're curious about that ongoing conversation, just know that there are Theory Underground hub events. That's kind of what we're calling them for right now. But basically the hub events are like this one coming up here. Like right here, as you can see, there was a hub event on July 11th. There's another hub event coming up on July 18th. And as you can see, there's an office hours event that happens during the hub event. But more importantly, there's a panel of presentations on hardcore theory, a panel of presentations on hip hop, as well as a special segment on critical media theory reflections, where even if you're not in that course, you still get to kind of partake in one of the things that's going on with that course. And these kind of hub events where it's like one Zoom call for the whole event, it's going to be like 6 or 7 hours long with different segments on different things, are really just an opportunity for people who are fellow travelers to drop in, to say hello, to kind of get the vibe, to see what's going on. And most importantly, for people who are in ongoing courses or in past courses, who have questions about the text, have questions about the lectures, who have reading reflections that they've done on that week's reading, who want to talk about it, to be able to come to the office hours, because every hub event will always have an office hour segment where basically the students in currently ongoing or past courses have priority, meaning that if you take this professional managerial class consciousness and ideology course, or the idea of the university course, or this, for they know not what they do course, any of these past courses that you take, you've got weekly questions as you go through it. You'll always have someone to come talk to during the office hour events that are happening at the Theory Underground Hub on a weekly basis. So I just really want to stress that, because otherwise you might feel like, oh, I'm left behind. These courses are already in the past. They're already over. There's nothing I can do. I just have to binge it on my own and I'd be all on my own. No. Not only is there a live ongoing office hours kind of event where you can come and discuss what you're doing, but more importantly, there's also the forums. And so a lot of the video conversations we have related to these specific courses, those videos get uploaded into the forums on those specific topics, and then you're looped in. And the people who have taken those courses in the past, they're reminded about the content of those courses, and maybe they want to go back over some of the stuff, and it kind of keeps the discourse centered around the subject matter, instead of just all of us talking, acting like, oh, well, we know what we're talking about. We know without even having gone through the same readings together. We just know that we all kind of know. We get it. No, this is what Heidegger calls idle chatter. This kind of communication that tends to happen online is symptomatic of what happens when all of the connections that we form are in these virtual networks that don't ever ground out in real life discourse. There's something about real life discourse with voices and faces and the actual kinds of non-perceivable pre-conscious things that occur in person that a lot of us are very removed from. And part of what I'm doing with Theory Underground is attempting to bring together my organic network with the virtual network. And so if you belong to the virtual network and you want to ground out in my organic network and actually get to know me and people that I'm fellow travelers with, like Ann Snellgrove or Brian Weeks or Elton L.K. of the Working Class Intelligentsia, people that I have co-instructed courses with, that I have as sort of connections in real life. You know what I mean? It's going to be these events that are on tour, that are your best way of actually grounding out from the virtual into what I'm calling real life relationships, right? And so hybridity between IRL and fully consumer, algorithmically enticed online, whatever the hell we're doing on here. Ultimately, what I've built here with the app and the website, as well as the publishing arm of all of it, is an opportunity for people to be in an ongoing lecture, research, and publishing cohort, and to be able to ground out in something more real than just the, whatever you get from the algorithm, and that provides the conditions of possibility to go from just being a part of the theory scene, where it's influencers on platforms talking to fans or whatever, to instead become a fellow traveler in an actual intellectual milieu, where whatever you put into it, you'll get back 100-fold. That's what I'm trying to lay the groundwork for here, is the sort of antidote to so many of my frustrations at the university, or trying to organize outside of university, or just trying to be some kind of a YouTuber or whatever. No, so much more important is what's coming from this tour, from this app, from these courses. And so if you're watching this, if you're thinking about getting involved, there's no time like the present, because really it's people's involvement in the first couple of years that makes all the difference. I understand that the longer these PSAs and the more unpolished or underproduced or less frequently published this YouTube channel actually is, the lower engagement is going to be. The algorithms will continuously neglect, right? But it is the people who watch all the way through and to the end who are already pretty serious, and they're looking to potentially get more involved, and that's who I care about. And the channel can ultimately wither away and die, because what's coming from my own platform and from my own medium is something that is capable of something so much more than anything anyone's ever imagined could come out of the internet. And the Timenergy book and the Timenergy course are coming very soon, and a lot of people have been excited about that and have been wanting more on that. And so if you are one of those people who's excited about it, register soon. Go to theory-underground.com, go to the Timenergy course, register for it. There's 4 tiers of involvement. Those who do will separate themselves from those who do not. And it's the doers ultimately that are going to make the difference. So I hope you're one of them, and I'll see you on the other side. Take care. Peace.